widespread use. The browser story is one of polyfills for older browsers like Internet Explorer, but it's pretty good, and coming forward, like MS Edge, for example, has moved on from thinking about implementing some of these standards to actually work in progress. So we're still using some polyfills for MS Edge, for Firefox, for Safari, although I believe Firefox is now supporting web components without a feature switch, without being behind a toggle as it's been up to now. So many of these things are coming to fruition. So web components, or what I'm talking about specifically, the web components is a series of specs, at which the most important specs that I can name right now are custom elements and the shadow DOM, or a thing called shadow DOM. These things work together, but they can be used independently. There's one other standard, I can't quite remember what it is. But basically those two things are what I'm going to be talking about today. And so I'm just going to use this code pen to just demonstrate how you can basically whip these things up in a browser. In production, you would need to put some polyfills in, you'd have to have a bit of a build process to deal with some of the old browsers. But all modern browsers, meaning Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Edge, can be made to enable this stuff in a very, very straightforward. There's basically a file that you can load that was done by Google, which essentially enables this across all browsers. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use some simple examples of HTML. First off, before I talk about custom elements, I'm going to talk about what an element is. Elements are, basically we talk about the DOM, the document object model of the browser. We're talking about the JavaScript programming interface that enables a programmer to come in and change the tree, the document tree. So the document starts at an element called document, which is in the global memory space, which has a body, which is the body, and a head. You'd be familiar with those in HTML. And then off that is a tree of nodes. Nodes can be anything from, primarily they're elements. Elements are those tags. Anything that's it's got a little angled bracket thing, you can call it an element. Or it could be an attribute, or it could be a text element, called a text node, I mean. So attributes, text nodes, and elements are the main things that we're interested in. So in this piece of HTML here, we have a div element, which has got an ID attribute, and it has a text node in the middle. And by default, it's going to get displayed over there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring up some code, and we just bring it in piece by piece so you can see what it does. This is stuff that you would have already done in many cases, but I just thought we'd just go over it a little bit. I'm just going to select the element based on its ID. Get element by ID, name card is the element, and then I'm going to grab the contents, the inner text, which is, it could be the inner HTML, but because this is just a simple element, it only has a text node with my name in it. So that's being assigned to the variable name. I hope that's bright enough to see. Then we could reassign the internals of that particular, let me just make sure I'm online, excuse me. Then we can, here we go. So we get that, and there we go. So it's just simply reassign the content with a string. It's a string template. The backtick represents a multi-line string of which the $name is actually pulling the name variable out of scope. This is a bit of new JavaScript, which is just much nicer than string concatenation. So you can see that all I've done is I've simply replaced the content with a bit of the old content plus a bit more string. So that's a very simple form of manipulation. The problem with that is it's destructive because I've just destroyed the original content of the tag. So there's a standard, as I mentioned before, called shadow DOM, which is essentially saying that this element's content is being rendered by default. If you just look at it in its original form, this is its original state. And we don't want to blow it away. We want to actually not display it. We want to actually use that as source data, and we want to actually manipulate that data as a parameter, stick it in that string. So one way is, instead of displaying the content by default, let's replace that content and make it invisible. And we'll have something else displayed there instead. So that's called the shadow DOM. The idea is that we're replacing the DOM in the middle of that element with something else. So we can do that by, we'll just select the element again, but this time we're going to go element, attach, shadow, mode, open, and all that means is that it's going to be extensible in a way that a closed mode, there doesn't seem to be any argument in favour of using closed mode, so it should actually be default, but it's something you have to specify each time. We attach a shadow, and you notice that automatically, suddenly that the content's no longer displayed, it's hidden. If we then go lm shadow root in a HTML capitals,
The second last letter in HTML.
sorry.
Is it on
Goodness gracious. Thanks, we did. Okay, so there you go. Now the shadow DOM, the shadow root is replacing the content. You might go, well, that's amazing. So let's just use this string now in preference to that one. Where's the original body of that element gone? It's actually available in what's called a slot. So if I just put the slot element, certainly you can see, and unfortunately it has to be closed, but you can do it like that. Basically, whatever was in the body of the element is now being dropped into that place of the slot. In fact, you can go further and you can use that slot multiple times. You can also break things up into, oh no, you can only use it once. Oh no, hang on, yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure why you can only use it once. So you can also name slots, so you can bring data in under different slots, because you might be wanting to bring in more than just a simple string like John Hardy. You might want to bring in a series of strings or a series of attributes. So let's just bring this one back. But this time I'm not changing the inner HTML, I'm changing the shadow root, inner HTML, and because we're not collecting the name, try that. Okay, 1 second. I think I've put it too early. Oh yeah, you're right, slot, thank you. Yes. That's right, we don't need the name. Just get rid of that one. Put. And there we go. So that's what a shadow DOM is, and if we wanted to be a little bit more fancy, we could have maybe had some additional, made these slots a little bit more specific. And we give these, that's called the default slot. But if we give them names, now we have to specify what we want. We can specify them by name.
So does the slot equate to the inner HTML
Yes, in this case, it now equates to the elements within the inner HTML. So now they're corresponding with this attribute that's been marked with the slot name. So that's probably the main difference. So we get a little bit more granularity. It means that we can now have a more complicated parameter system. Essentially, it looks like this. And we can basically, so this is not a custom element, this is just an ordinary element which I've just attached a shadow to. So now what is a custom element? Whereas before, it's just a conventional element with the name, with an ID of name card, and we conventionally are calling it a name card, but it's really just a div. Custom elements gives you the ability to extend the alphabet of the vocabulary of the HTML language itself. So instead of just, B and image and div and span and all those, you can add your own. The main defining characteristic of a custom element is that it has a double barrel name. It always has to have a hyphen in it, and that's so the browser automatically detects custom elements. If it didn't have that, then it wouldn't. This stuff won't work. You have to put a hyphen in the name. But basically, name card, and I'm passing here an attribute. And I've got some code here, which I'll just bring in.
10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Yes, gotcha. Yes, we'll try and keep this all. So we have we have a class, which is a JavaScript class, which is a fairly new feature of the language. We're calling it name card, but the name doesn't matter. It has to extend one of the HTML elements to be active. It doesn't have to be HTML, it can actually just extend HTML button element or any other kind of element. But essentially, the easiest and most widely supported browser support at the moment is to extend HTML element, which means you will get the behavior of any elements, the superclass of all elements in the browser. So we can have a constructor which does nothing more than call it superclass. Then we're just going to grab the attribute out of this particular one, and we're going to store that in name, and we're going to use the inner HTML business again. At the moment, you can see nothing being displayed because, well, it is being displayed, just there's nothing visually interesting being displayed. Once we register this with the browser, there's a global registry called custom elements. We call define, we give it a name, and we give it its implementation class. And bang, suddenly it's done. It's already basically assigned its body, but it wasn't visible to you. Now this isn't using a shadow DOM, it's simply using its attribute value and replacing its body. But obviously, based on what I was talking about before, shadow DOMs give you a bit more power. So I'm just going to demonstrate one that uses the shadow DOM. So here we have a class, and just quickly explain it. We just do call super again. We then do attach a shadow, and then we set the body, and we can use slots. So in this case, I'm using the body of the name card as the slot again. And bang, we have a custom element which does nothing more than format in a nicer way the particular text that I wanted. That could have been turned into a name card or something which had its own behaviour. So I'm going to demonstrate now. This is using just raw JavaScript out of the box, no frameworks, no. Here's an example of a stopwatch. Basically, it has a start and stop button. It has a reset. Start and stop. So all it's doing is, again, my stopwatch. It's taking the text of this and it's putting that as its heading. So I'm using that as a slot, basically. So there, okay. It's got a class called my stopwatch. It's being defined further down. I'm just going to go right to the bottom and show custom elements define my stopwatch using this class. And the constructor calls it super class, it attaches its shadow, and then the shadow root is what we do the DOM manipulation on. it does an initial inner HTML just to initialize everything. So the first thing it shows is H1 with the slot, takes the stopwatch text and puts that up there. Then it has an H2, which is going to have the number of the counter. Then we're going to have two buttons, start and reset. Although start changes its value based on its state. You can see it goes start, stop, start, stop. And we have a little bit of just a little bit of utility function here called render func, which just wraps up the rendering thing in a way that just prevents it from calling too many times. It's just a way of preventing multiple calls to the same render. Then it sets up, then it does some event binding. Like I say, this is really low level, we're not using any frameworks. So all I'm doing is I'm looking for the toggle button, which is this one, and I'm attaching a click handler which calls a call to do toggle, which flips its state, and I also call the reset button by an event that's bound to the reset. And now I've got two actual variables that the component actually manages itself. It has an active state, which is turned on and off by this button. And it has a counter value, which is incremented every single time it can. And we have a reset, which will set it back to 0 and set the label back to start, back to inactive. When the element is first added to the DOM, a lifecycle hook called connected callback happens. So this is a standard callback that happens on elements that when the element is stuck into the DOM tree by the browser in this case, it calls this connected callback. And this is a good place to do some initialization if you need to. In my case, I'm just calling it to making it render to the DOM any updates that need to be done, but it also sets up an interval. And that interval will just call every 100th of a second, every 100th of a second, or every 10 milliseconds, the do tick function.
Is it connected callback a built-in function or?
Yes, connected callback is a built-in function, and disconnected callback is also a built-in function, which happens when the DOM element is removed from the document. And I'm using that to cancel the interval because I don't want that interval to be firing off when the element is no longer active. So do toggle, what it does is it flips the state of the active and it calls the render. Reset takes the active, sets it to false, and it sets the counter to 0 and it does a render. Do tick, it says if it's active, then increment the value of the counter and render each time it updates the counter. And then request render is just a way to prevent multiple renders. If multiple people have called this render function, it sets a little flag to just prevent it from happening too many times. And then it actually calls to do this on the next 60th of a second. It's a good time to synchronize your animations with the animation and frame rate, which is 60 times a second. So basically, here we go, and the render is simply updating the bits of the DOM that change. In this case, it grabs the shadow root, it then puts in the value of the counter into the H2, and then it gets the toggle and it changes its value to stop or start based on this state of the active. Okay, so that's really still pretty low level JavaScript. You're not using anything to make your life easier, but it's still pretty effective and not that hard. And so you can make a custom element using just run-of-the-mill stuff. And I've only got 2 minutes, so I'm just going to quickly rush forward and say, if you use a slightly more advanced thing called lit HTML, then you can cut down a lot. Instead of having to treat the initial render, where we set up the initial inner HTML in the constructor and then change the bits that we care about manually, all we have to do is set up a single function or method called render, and this is smart enough to render once and then only change the bits that change. So this is which I haven't got enough time to go into, but it is as efficient as virtual DOM in terms of only modifying the parts that need to change. So when we call this render function, it looks inefficient because it looks like it's recreating the world every single time you call it, but it actually only recreates or updates the bits that actually need changing. So just quickly go back and see that it therefore shortens the code somewhat, and you can see these little holes in the template. You can also see you can define your event handlers in place, just like you would in, say, React or whatever. So it looks a lot more like an application framework. It starts to feel like Angular or React. And you could imagine writing such a component. You can go one step further. You can see here I'm calling render all the time, still, or request render actually. I call request render every time something changes. You can equally set up an observation situation. So here I've set up basically a observe properties function, which basically intercepts any changes on those properties and automatically calls property change callback, which can be used to then call render. So anytime any of the properties that you care about, and in this case we're only caring about active and counter, as soon as as either of those properties change, then it's going to immediately call the render, and you can see away it goes again. But basically those are just kind of like little bits of utility function to make things easier. So that's basically custom elements. Really they do everything that component frameworks offer you. The main thing is that they can work well with other frameworks. So if you were writing a React application, you could write an element in this and mount it into your virtual DOM and it will work. Furthermore, you could write the updating code in React inside the custom element. So custom elements can actually be written in React, but you can also use things like lit.html, which is what I've just used here, or you can just use jQuery or just straight DOM manipulation in JavaScript if that's your thing. You're not tied to any particular thing. And in theory, you could make these components bigger and bigger on the page. You could be an entire panel written this way, in which case you could imagine actually coming from the bottom up and replacing more and more of your application with web components, which is, in fact, you could build an entire application using web applications, and you can just do routing. So that's really my presentation.
You can nest elements, right? Custom elements.
Mm-hmm.
So you can nest elements, so kind of take an atomic
Yes.
or modular approach to creating pages.
Yes, that's right. You can nest custom elements, which are just essentially nestable, just like HTML. So a custom element can contain a body. That's really what I was talking about with regard to slots. Effectively, what you're doing is you're bringing in more elements, some of which could be custom, some of them could be just standard HTML built in. Yeah, so composition at any level of granularity is the thing. Is there any other questions?
So like developers, we normally want to separate concerns. This class is kind of a controller view altogether. How do you see if you can separate this view part to a separate file and maybe a model, just imported a model and to make this class just controller?
I think there's a bit of a two-way thing going on here. Like in React, people are actually bringing their JavaScript and their view together because essentially the view is really just a function. So while you can certainly import things in, you would probably import effectively this structure here, which is the HTML thing here. You could probably export that whole thing.
That was one of the other standards, HTML templates that make up web components and ES modules.
Yes.
They're the last two.
So instead of using inner HTML is slow, really slow. Even just to blank out the content of that element from before, if I used inner HTML equals empty string, it will be something like 50 times slower than if I'd gone through and iterated and removed the elements using JavaScript. It's a really slow technique. So the minute you have to do any work in inner HTML, you're really in trouble. So one of those things is the templates, which is HTML templates as a standard part of the web component spec. I didn't use those because under the hood, lit.html actually utilizes HTML templates as their way of storing the once parsed. Once you go through this thing, it gets converted into an HTML template internally. So this particular framework, as I say, it's not really a framework, it's more a library. It's called lit.html. It comes from Google. It's originally part of the Polymer project. But once they sort of happened upon this particular model, which they actually learned from somebody else in the open source community who invented hyper-HTML, a guy called Andre Giamacci. Google did their own version, and I have to say I find this one slightly easier to use than hyper-HTML, but essentially they're the same idea. And once they did that, they realized we don't need to have a complicated framework for Polymer anymore. Polymer can just boil down to raw JavaScript. Just use lit HTML. You don't need a virtual DOM. You don't need anything. You just use JavaScript straight out of the box.
So where that shadow's where are you pulling that from?
Shadow is built into the browser.
Okay.
So shadow is a capability you can put on any element. So if you find a div which is full of text, you can just attach shadow DOM, suddenly that text disappears. But you could then access that text and manipulate it and display it the way you want.
So does that come from extending the HTML element? The ability to use it, attach shadow?
Attach shadow, yes, this is a built-in DOM method on any HTML element.
That is exposed to extending.
Yes, its purpose is basically to turn off its default behavior so that you can stick an alternative DOM structure there. It is very similar to Angular. It's very similar to transclusion. If you ever got into that kind of stuff with Angular directives where you've got basically slots to fill in, they're called transclusion in AngularJS. Nobody understood them very well, so it's like you have to go be deep into that stuff to even want to go there, but it's actually pretty straightforward. You can have these named slots and you can just drop in content that way. And of course you can read the attributes. You can also read properties. So properties can be grab hold of that element and start jamming elements in there, and your class will make use of those as well. So if you wanted to pass in, say you had to display a table, you would probably want to set the value of the property rather than send the data in via an attribute, or send the data in as a slot. So you've got three ways of parameterizing. You've got the slot, which is body content. You've got attributes, which are a traditional way to send in string values and numbers and things, and booleans. And you've got properties, which are simply the properties on the JavaScript object, which is the element. And you can intercept changes on those. So you can be notified if an attribute changes, you can be notified if property changes, and that's pretty much it.
So John, the suggestion might be between lines here that you could effectively just implement this and not have to use React or... Absolutely.
So that's a pretty extreme position, but it's essentially, and because it's still relatively early and because we're still dealing with the Internet Explorer, legacy issues and so on, some people, there's only a relatively few number of people who are embracing that exact model, but it's going to grow. So if you want to see where it's not, React is where the situation is now. If you want to look in 5 years' time, it's going to be a mixture of React, Vue.js, this, that, and the other thing, and then people are going to share their stuff as web components. And some of those will be raw JavaScript, some of those will be lit HTML. Some things will be Preact and React and Stencil.js, all of these different ways of doing the same job. It'll all be basically which one people feel more comfortable with. But I could write, right now, I would be quite comfortable in writing a full application, which includes routing and all of those things using web components, because all that a route does is essentially translates a URL into a component to be displayed, shown or hidden based on the route. And there are third-party routers that you can use for that sort of thing.
So jump out of the frameworks war.
Yeah, and we're never going to resolve the wars because everyone's going to have different tastes. But it means that there's not a single way to do things, and these days they're no longer incompatible. So I'm really trying to embrace this as not as React or web components. And if you go to the React website, there's actually a section on web components, and they say they're not fighting each other. They're orthogonal. They're really on different axes, and that while React doesn't require web components, if you want to use a third-party web component in your React app, I can't think of a way that you could do that. If someone wrote a really nice date picture or something, how would you bring that into your React app? Well, one way would be to wrap it as a web component and then bring it in. And so it really increases the level of interoperability between different frameworks. And so that's my talk.
Well,